Welcome to Tales from the Jails, a history of Stewart County's many jails. I'm Jim Long. In this presentation, I'll be talking about all the jails that Stewart County has had, as well as the people on both sides of the bars, both the sheriffs and the prisoners. If you don't know how many jails Stewart County has had, think of a number now and we'll see how close you came. During this talk, I'll be referring to a plat of the town of Dover that was drawn in 1911 by George H. Dobson. Mr. Dobson was a timber man, but he clearly had a skill as a draftsman as well. This is a copy of a town plat that has existed since the beginning of Dover and was redrawn over the years. I'm going to zoom in on a section of this plat so that you can see how this plat works. This is the lower end of Petty Street by the river. You see for reference here the Dover Hotel is on lot number 112, and each lot in the town of Dover had its own lot number, and those lot numbers have never changed in the history of the town. Across Petty Street from the Dover Hotel, you see lot number 82, and that's where the Martin family lived. This plat was donated to us, to the Stewart County Archives, by Martha Martin Pyle. On lot number 111, next door to the Dover Hotel, lived Florence Dobson, widow of George H. Dobson, who drew this plat. And so you can see the connection from the Dobson family to the Martin family. And we appreciate Martha's donation of this plat to the Stewart County Archives. Stewart County was organized in March of 1804. The first sheriff was William Curl, and he was elected by the justices of the peace. There were 3 of them at the time. Sheriffs were not yet elected by popular vote. The sheriff collected the taxes for the county. He kept order at the terms of court. He went and summoned people to court, but he didn't have a jail to operate out of just yet. The first criminal that we know about in Stewart County was Charles Arrington. He was indicted by the grand jury in December of 1804. We don't know exactly what he did, but we know a jury trial was held and that he was fined $10 in court costs. The record says that he was committed until paid, but we don't know where he was committed because there was no jail yet at this time. In January of 1806, almost 2 years after the county was organized, Robert Nelson donated the 1-acre public square to the county for the purposes of building a courthouse, and court first met in that courthouse in June of 1806. Robert Nelson was the founder of the town of Dover. It was his land on which Dover was built. He had the town surveyed, drawn up into the lots that we see in the plat, and sold all of the lots. He himself lived in Montgomery County. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, a land speculator, a politician. It wasn't until 1808 that the first mention of a jail occurred in Stewart County. The county court in April of 1808 authorized a jail tax for what they called a district jail. You can see here the amount of the tax for each white pole. That was 3 cents for the jail tax. A white pole was any free white male between the ages of 21 and 50 years old. For this jail tax, everybody who owned a town lot also paid 3 cents. For each 100 acres of land that you owned, you paid 3 cents. Each stud horse owner paid $1 for the jail tax. Each merchant in town paid $5, and then each black pole owner paid 6 cents. A black pole at this time was any enslaved person between the ages of 12 and 50. So the county court authorized this jail tax in April of 1808, and then in July of 1808, they appointed the first jail commissioners. You see here Joshua Williams, James Taggart, and Thomas French ordered to let the building of a jail on the public square in Dover and make return to the next court. Here in the corner, I show you where I think the jail was probably located. It was on the public square, courthouse being in the middle. This would be Spring Street heading down the hill towards Petty Street. The river would be in this direction. And since the town first developed down Spring Street and down Petty Street, I think they probably tucked the jail here in behind the courthouse. At the archives, we have the document in which the description of the first jail was written. You see on the screen here the original document. And at the left, I've transcribed it for you to show you what that first jail was to look like. Oak timber, 12-foot or 12-inch timbers, floored, 8 feet between the floors, so 8-foot ceilings. Good oak plank 2 inches thick for the flooring. One thing that pops out of this description here are the chestnut shingles. We don't use chestnut anymore because of the light. The document here says that the whole work was to be done in a neat workmanlike manner. It goes on to say that the doors to this first jail were to be 5 feet high and 2 feet 3 inches wide. That's quite a small door by today's standards. The document is signed August 27th, 1808 by the jail commissioners. There's a note at the bottom of the document that says the person who wins the bid for this jail is going to get a third of the money at the October court of 1808, 2/3 the second third when the jail was complete, and then the balance when the jail tax was collected. The winning bid for this first jail was won by William Cooper at a cost of $152, and he had that jail ready for use in February of 1809. Took less than 6 months to build the first jail. Sheriffs in that first jail, it was taken possession of by Sheriff Jesse Denson. He was the third sheriff of Stewart County, but he himself ran into some trouble soon into his reception of this jail. He was indicted by the grand jury for extortion and forced to resign. The story there was that a man named Jesse Rasco had been indicted by the court, but he was found to be not guilty, and the sheriff was sent to let Mr. Rasco know that he was not guilty. Instead, the sheriff decided to extort money from him in order to have the charges dropped, and the sheriff was found out and indicted for extortion. He was replaced by Abner Pierce, who was appointed by the justices of the peace, but soon into his term he resigned. He was replaced by John Allen, who served a couple of terms. He was a good sheriff. But he began a tradition in May of 1810 protesting the sufficiency of the jail. And at this time, the jail is less than a year old, but the sheriff has already lost confidence in that jail. Sheriff Allen was succeeded by Thomas Buckingham, who served 3 terms, but he himself protested the sufficiency of the jail like his predecessor did. And in fact, some of the prisoners were carried to the jail in Clarksville because of the insufficiency of the Stewart County jail. Finally, in August of 1814, the county court appointed a committee to superintend the repairing of the jail. And in May of 1815, they paid John Colson $93.75 for repairing a jail that was just 7 years old at the time, almost as much as the jail cost itself to build. Some of the occupants of this first jail. In the May 1812 court minutes, we see that Yancey Thornton was reimbursed $3.25 for providing provisions to a prisoner who was committed on suspicion of being a man of dangerous principles. One wonders what in 1812 would have been considered dangerous principles. In August of 1810, John Dare was put into this jail for stealing from Henry Starr in Dover a spotted handkerchief, 9 yards of calico, and an ounce of white thread. That landed him in jail. John Dare spent 7 weeks in this jail, and the jail was right there on the public square next to the courthouse. When his trial date came up, the sheriff was sent over to the jail to get John Dare, and on the back of the order, the sheriff wrote, "Not found, as the said John Dare or some other person aiding him broke the jail of Stewart County, and the said Dare has made his escape." So we have our first escape from the first jail of Stewart County. I suppose you could say John Dare made a daring escape. One of my favorite occupants of this first jail, or 2 favorite occupants, from the February 1811 court minutes, we see ordered by the court that Josiah Britt be chained down to the floor so that he can't get to the wall, and Henry Wyatt be fixed so that he can't get to the wall as above, and Duncan McCrae be appointed the jailer to see the above business fixed, and to see the door fastened well. The story here was that a woman named Elizabeth Hudson had her horse go missing. She went to the sheriff and said, "I think Henry Wyatt has my horse." So the sheriff goes to Henry Wyatt and says, "Hey, Henry, do you know anything about Mrs. Hudson's horse being missing?" And the next sound heard was the horse. Henry Wyatt was found in possession of Mrs. Hudson's horse. But he said, "Oh, wait a minute, I didn't steal this horse. I traded it to a man named Josiah Britt. So the sheriff goes to Josiah Britt to ask about this horse. And on their way to jail with Josiah Britt, the sheriff says, "Hey, Josiah, what's up with the letters H and T branded on your thumbs?" Josiah says, "Oh, I may have gotten into a little bit of trouble over in Montgomery County." So the sheriff sends to Montgomery County for Josiah Britt's criminal record and finds out that he was a convicted horse thief. The H and the T branded on his thumb stand for horse thief. Josiah had been convicted in Montgomery County. He had 30 lashes in the public square, 2 days in the stockade, jail time, and branded on his thumbs with an H and a T. When the trial came up in Stewart County, Henry Wyatt was actually acquitted and released because he was just an accomplice. They decided that Josiah Britt had stolen Mrs. Hudson's horse, and we can see from a docket book at the Stewart County Archives what happened to Josiah. Josiah was sentenced to be hung on the 29th day of April, 1811, by order of the court. But we also see a notation below that, broke jail and gone. So Josiah Britt, the convicted horse thief, also broke out of this first jail. By 1820, it was probably time for a new jail because Sheriff James Mallory continued the tradition of protesting the sufficiency of the jail. Here you see he says that the jail is entirely insufficient. Prisoners were sent to the jails in Clarksville and to Charlotte. What did the county court do about this protest? Nothing for nearly 2 years later. But finally, in November of 1821, the county court published specifications for what would be jail number 2 for the county. A little bit larger, 22 feet square. This time, this jail is going to have a 4-foot dungeon, 2 stories high, thick walls, 12-inch timbers, thick doors, and iron bars on the windows. So clearly, they're thinking about preventing more escapes from this second jail. The old jail was sold for scrap and torn down. Jail number 2 was built on the same site on the public square. The newspaper ran an advertisement opening the bids for this jail number 2, and the winning bidder was John Scarborough, who won the bid at $1,560, 10 times the amount that the first jail had cost. So clearly they were looking at building a more substantial building that maybe was escape proof. This second jail was completed in July of 1823. It's about 3 months late, but they still paid Mr. Scarborough his full contract amount. Some of the sheriffs that worked out of jail number 2, James Hogan, took possession of it, but before he was finished with his term as sheriff, he had resigned and moved to Alabama. He was succeeded by Thomas Ward, who served several terms as sheriff. He was a good sheriff, but he himself resigned. His successor was Henry L. Atkins, who served several terms. At the same time he was sheriff, Henry Atkins owned and operated a hotel and tavern on Petty Street at a location that some of you will remember as Mattie Morgan's boarding house. That hotel had been built in 1819, a much older structure than the Dover Hotel, which wouldn't be built until the 1850s. Some of the occupants of jail number 2. George Taylor murdered Benjamin Griffin with an axe in October of 1826. This was the 3rd documented murder in the county. Initially, Mr. Taylor told the Sheriff Ward that Mr. Griffin had struck him in the head with an axe. But on the way to jail to get more information out of Mr. Taylor, the sheriff said, "Hey, George, what's up with the letter M branded on your left thumb?" And George Taylor says, "Oh, I might have gotten into a little bit of trouble in Davidson County." So the sheriff sends to Davidson County for George Taylor's criminal record and finds out he had been convicted of murder in Davidson County in 1824. In the trial here in Stewart County, George Taylor was found guilty, but the jury said he didn't have a malice aforethought, so he was instead convicted of felonious slaying. Nevertheless, the judge did sentence him to death by hanging in October of 1827, a year after the murder. However, the Supreme Court overturned that conviction, and best I can tell, George Taylor was released and lived the rest of his life in Stewart County, dying in the 1830s. Occupants of this other jail also included runaway slaves. Here you see an advertisement that was placed in the Nashville newspaper in March of 1828. A slave named Charles, who said that he belonged to Allen McLean of Kentucky, had been caught as a runaway slave. And you can see here this advertisement is by William Bailey, who was the county jailer of Stewart County. And this was how the law worked when runaway slaves were captured. The jailer was obligated to put an advertisement in the newspaper so that the owner of the runaway slave had a chance to learn about the escape and could come and pay the expenses and get his enslaved person back. Jail number 2 started a county tradition. In 1829, it burned to the ground. We see a newspaper clipping here from Nashville that says the fire was, the alarm was given and that a runaway slave was trapped in the dungeon of this jail. They give the name here, Jack, said he belonged to Mr. Nathan Johnson in the vicinity of Huntsville, Alabama. And Jack died in this fire. This newspaper clipping says that the fire was intentional, but we have no record at the Stewart County Archives that there was ever an investigation into this fire, certainly no indictment for arson about this. A month after this fire, the county court did take action, ordering the old walls and irons of the jail to be sold, and whoever bought the old brick had 30 days to remove it from the public square. However, the county court was not quick to take action after this jail burned. It was actually 8 months later, in July of 1830, that the county purchased from John Scarborough lot number 82, which was at the lower end of Petty Street across from what would eventually become the Dover Hotel, but there was no hotel on lot number 112 at the time. Scarborough sold the town lot for $75 to the county. He's the guy who had built jail number 2 that had burned down. This jail number 3 did have a lower dungeon. It also had living quarters for the jailer and his family. Prisoners during this time of no jail were sent to the Humphreys County Jail in Reynoldsburg. I want to show you what was going on Petty Street at the time that the jail began to be located here. On lot number 112 was just a private residence at the time. Next door to the jail on 81, lot 81 was another private residence. Here on lot 110 at the corner of the alley was a hotel run by the Petty family, and that's how Petty Street got its name. Across from that was the stable, the parking lot for the hotel. More private residences as you go up towards Spring Street. Here on lot number 108 was Henry Atkins Hotel. This is again the site that would years later be known as Mattie Morgan's boarding house. And then on the corner of Petty Street and Spring Street, Henry Atkins had a tavern. So John Scarborough sold this town lot. He had built the previous jail, and perhaps not by coincidence, he won the bid to build jail number 3. Jail was completed in November of 1831. Some of the sheriffs who worked out of this jail, Henry Atkins, as we mentioned before, that owned the hotel on lot 108, took possession of this 3rd jail. He was succeeded by William B. Cherry, who was elected in 1836 by popular vote. Tennessee had gotten a new constitution in 1834, and so William B. Cherry was the first sheriff elected by popular vote instead of being elected by the county court. He was succeeded by Abiathar Wallace, who during his tenure reported the condition of the jail to be as strong as it ever has been. He was succeeded by a man named Samuel Boofter or Bufter. The reason I'm unsure about how to pronounce his name is because the clerk would sometimes spell it Boofter, so I'm thinking the name was either Bufter or Boofter. This jail was on the lower end of Petty Street, right next to the river and the lower ferry landing and the wharf. Think about the impression that that jail made, as the first thing you saw when you got off the boat in Dover was the jail. Some of the occupants of jail number 3, the Timms brothers, Reuben and Larkin Timms, had actually broken out of the jail in Dickson County in September of 1835, where they had been jailed for horse stealing. The next day after the escape, they were seen near Dover on horses that were known to be stolen, so Sheriff Atkins took them into custody and put them into this jail number 3. They went to trial at circuit court at the courthouse, and they each were found guilty and sentenced to 5 years in the state penitentiary. The records of the state penitentiary do survive at the State Library and Archives in Nashville, and those records have been abstracted into a couple of great books called Tennessee Convicts by Chuck Sherrill, the former state librarian and archivist. In those books, we see descriptions of all of the prisoners, and that was so that if there was an escape, there would be known physical descriptions of these guys so that they might be apprehended. The description of the Larkins brothers or the Timms brothers were in this book, and I wanted to show you those. Reuben was said to be 4'10 3/4", 116 pounds, little guy. He had a small scar on his forehead, occasioned by the bite of a horse, it says. It says he was a little bow-legged, and that his big toe was much shorter than the toes next to them. Larkin, the younger guy, was 5'6", a little taller, but it said he had a countenance not indicative of the confirmed rascal, so he didn't look like a horse thief, is the implication there. These Timms brothers were originally from South Carolina. They had lived in several places in Tennessee, but at the time of this horse thievery and escape, they were residents of Paducah. Both had been sentenced to 5 years. Larkin got a bit of a reprieve by Governor James K. Polk. He got out 2 months early from his 5-year sentence. But Reuben had to serve his full 5-year sentence, and a note on his record said that his conduct was bad. Other occupants of this jail, Martin Butler, got 25 days in the dungeon and $25 for stealing bacon from Wood Yateman and Company at Cumberland Iron Works, and that seems a fitting punishment to me for stealing bacon. John Keel and Nancy Ormsby were indicted in 1835 for what was called open and notorious lewdness. This was living together while not being husband and wife. John got 40 days in the jail and a $10 fine. Nancy just got a $5 fine. It was unusual for women to be jailed during this time. Also in this jail were the Manning brothers, Calvin and Clements Manning, as well as William King. They had been indicted for the murder of Robert Huff in 1841. This was a sensational murder, and for their safety, these defendants spent quite a bit of time in the Clarksville jail. During their trial, William King was acquitted and released, but the Manning brothers got 2.5 years in the state penitentiary. So this jail, the 1831 jail, seems to have lasted in good condition for about 14 years and then suffered some sort of building collapse in 1845. At the April 1845 term of County Court instituted a new jail tax to fund, quote, the building of a county jail. The commissioners that were appointed were told to look at the expediency of rebuilding the old wall, so we know that part of the building was still intact, but the commissioners were given leeway to build a new jail entirely and salvage what they could. 3 months later, the plan for jail number 4 was released. It was called A Description of a Public Jail for Stewart County to be built on the same foundation of the old one. So they were going to reuse the existing foundation but rebuild the upper structure. However, this time they were going to have 2 dungeons, and instead of being 4 feet deep, they were going to be 8 feet deep, again with 12-inch timbers. There was going to be a nice jailer's apartment nearby, and 12-foot walls above the stone foundation, so a single-story structure here, but a shingled roof and nice painted doors and painted windows. The notice for the bidding on this new jail was put in the Clarksville paper. You can see here that the jail commissioners had advertised, "You that desire cash for your labor, come on the day above mentioned, and you will stand as good a chance as any." But that may not have been actually true, because the winning bidder on jail number 4 was one of the jail commissioners himself, John James, who won the bid at $979. Not as expensive as the prior jail because they were able to reuse the foundation. This jail was built on schedule, on time, completed in October of 1846. One of the first people eligible to be put in that new jail, unfortunately, was the sheriff, Samuel Bufter, who in 1846 had been indicted for gaming. He pled guilty and was fined $5 in court costs, But because of this conviction, the county required him to provide additional cosigners on his bonds as sheriff to indemnify the county against any further shenanigans. And unfortunately, there were further shenanigans. In 1846, October, when the jail had opened, the sheriff was further indicted for collecting county taxes and not turning them in, also for collecting court judgments but not handing them over to the winning plaintiffs. In total, he was ordered by the court to pay over $2,000 in taxes, fines, and court costs that he was embezzling, and he resigned a few months later. His successors in working in this jail included Elisha Dawson, who was reelected 3 times. He was a popular sheriff, a very well-respected man. After his tenure as sheriff, he went on to serve many terms as the county trustee, the county bookkeeper. So very respected in his ability, his integrity to manage the county funds. Sheriff Dawson was succeeded by Jesse Parchman, who served 1 term, and then he was succeeded by E.T. Bogard, who served several terms as sheriff, and he was actually the sheriff at the time of the Civil War. More about him in a moment. Some of the occupants of jail number 4 included Marga Fowler and Catherine Fowler, who were said to be spinsters. They spent 10 days rather in jail after being indicted in 1846. You see the indictment here on the right. And what the indictment says is that they were keeping a disorderly house by then and there permitting persons, both men and women, of evil name and fame, and of dishonest conversation then and there, and on divers other days, at nights and times, unlawfully did permit whoring and misbehaving. So they were running a house of prostitution. It goes on in the indictment to say that they also allowed a slave to be one of the customers at this establishment, and that was an especially offensive crime above and beyond the prostitution. In 1854, Mary Fiedler was convicted of a similar offense. She got a fine of $50, but only 10 minutes in jail. Also in this jail was Bob Woods, who had been enslaved by Stacker Woods and Company. He murdered a fellow slave named Anthony Darby in October of 1846. The jury found him guilty, sentenced him to be hung in December, but he did get a new trial, and that resulted in a mistrial in July of 1847. So while he's awaiting his new trial, Bob escaped, and the jailer, Bryce Sanders, was found to be not negligent in that escape. Also in this jail were 2 people indicted for another sensational murder in the county. Barry and Mary, who were slaves of John Fletcher, were indicted for murdering their mistress, Penina Fletcher, in January of 1851. The story here is that on this cold morning of January 19, 1851, Mistress Penina Fletcher had ordered Barry to go out into the cornfields and pick corn. And Barry worked for hours in that cold January morning. And then, thinking that the family was away at church because this was a Sunday, he went into Mary's cabin and sat by the fire and fell asleep. But unbeknownst to him, Mrs. Fletcher had not gone to church that day. She found him asleep by the fire in Mary's cabin and took a board and hit him and knocked him into the fire. He came to his senses, recovered from the burns, and took that board and hit Mrs. Fletcher up against the head, and then finished her off, killed her with an axe. Barry and Mary were put into jail, and they were in jail for a year, awaiting their trials to come up. They were granted separate trials, and Mary, even though she had tried to plead guilty and take the blame, was found not guilty by the jury and released. Barry admitted that he did kill Mrs. Fletcher. He said there were extenuating circumstances, though, that Mrs. Fletcher had always been cruel to her slaves, and that she had actually killed his mother. Barry was found guilty by a jury. He was sentenced to be hanged. However, the Supreme Court overturned the conviction, granted Barry a new trial, saying that the jury had ignored the clear evidence that Mrs. Fletcher had been cruel in her treatment of her slaves. So they granted a new trial, and in that new trial, Berry was also acquitted. This was quite interesting to me because I never had the sense growing up that slaves got fair justice in the justice system. But here you see a murder that took place, and both people who were indicted for it were acquitted. The ruling here was basically that Mrs. Fletcher had been violent to her slaves, and so the homicide was justifiable. We don't know anything about Barry after this trial, but we do know that Mary went on to get married after the Civil War. She survived the Civil War and Emancipation and got married in 1871. I want to bring you forward to 1856. This jail is now 10 years old, which is getting pretty old for a Stewart County jail. So in April of 1856, the county court gets a report from the jail commissioners, and the jail commissioners find this jail, jail number 4, as being unsafe for the keeping of prisoners, and they recommend that no more prisoners be put into the jail. The following day, the county court publishes plans for what would be jail number 5 in the county. A little bit larger than the previous jail, a little bit bigger foundation walls, 10-foot ceilings in the dungeons, so even deeper dungeons with trap doors. So they're again trying to make this jail more escape proof than the predecessors. An upper floor with a 7-foot ceiling, and then thick 13-inch brick walls. This description, it was written into the county court minutes, and there are very extensive descriptions about the dungeons, so they appeared to want to get the dungeons right in jail number 5. The committee was granted the permission to either repair the interior walls of this jail, tear the whole thing down, or even build somewhere else. A special jail tax was again levied in July of 1856. The bid went to Schuyler Martin and John Lemaster to build for $1,500. By November of 1856, we know that the jail was not yet finished because prisoner J.G. Kearney was sent to the Montgomery County Jail, the record saying there being no jail in Stewart County. So construction's underway in late 1856 on jail number 5. And this is a pivotal moment in the history of Stewart County. Something pivotal was about to happen. And what was happening at the end of 1856 was the rumors of a slave insurrection in Montgomery, Christian, Stewart, Trigg counties. Dover formed a vigilance committee of 8 men to investigate the rumors, to patrol the area, punish any alleged offenders. The 8 members of this committee were movers and shakers in Dover. I show you their names here. Christopher Dudley, William B. Cherry, who was the former sheriff, John Tomlinson, James Lee Jr., a merchant, Edward Wynn, a merchant, Dr. Smith, Nicholas Parrish, who worked at the Cumberland Iron Works, and attorney Nathan Brandon. So these were all movers and shakers in Dover, and also slaveholders. That was key to being a member of the Vigilance Committee. The members of the committee rounded up alleged leaders. Some received what was said to be well-deserved castigation, and some were executed. The Goodspeed's history of the county, that was written a couple decades later, says that 6 leaders were hanged and that their heads were placed on poles as a warning to anyone else who might try to lead the insurrection. We know from the county records, though, of only 3 slaves that were hanged, and we know that because E.P. Lemaster was reimbursed by the county for 3 coffins. We know the name of one of those 3 slaves who was hanged. His name was Henry King, and he was a preacher. And the reason we know this is because his enslaver, Mary King, sued in circuit court about a year later. The case was called Mary King and John A. King versus Christopher Dudley and others. So Mrs. King, the owner of Henry King the slave, was suing the 8 members of the Vigilance Committee for killing her slave. She was suing for $1,000, and the defendants, the members of the Vigilance Committee, admitted the debt, admitted that they did owe her $1,000 because they had killed her slave. So the judge ordered the Vigilance Committee members to pay her $1,000 plus back interest. However, the county court reimbursed the 8 members of this committee for the fine and interest that they were charged. This event, the rumors of the slave insurrection, which never actually happened, the execution certainly did happen. The insurrection didn't happen, but it did alter the plans for the jail that was partially under construction. In January of 1857, which was right after the events took place and the executions took place, county court appointed a committee to look at the work that had been done so far. John Master, one of the winning bidders of building this jail, had asked the county to increase his budget up to $2,000. The committee that examined the work found the walls to be sufficient to answer the purposes of county jail, but they did recommend iron bars to be installed in the windows to prevent anything being handed through. They also wanted to make an elbow in the privy holes. I love the term privy holes there, the outhouses, so that nothing could be handed through them. This suggests, one, that there was no damage to this jail during the insurrection, or the fear of an insurrection, rather, but that maybe they saw some opportunities for making what was being constructed even more secure. So this was January of 1857. They had suggested these corrections. By April of 1857, work was not progressing fast enough. The county court said, get it done, get it done. By July of 1857, work was still not progressing fast enough to make the county happy, so they fired the jail committee and appointed a new jail committee and authorized them to spend up to another $1,000 to just get the thing done. By October of 1857, the county court did authorize the sheriff to start putting prisoners in the newly built jail. So the jail that had been deemed insufficient in early 1856 was finally ready for occupation in late 1857. The court ordered that the wall of the jail to be received. They had increased the budget to $2,000, and they finally got that fifth jail built in late 1857. E.T. Bogard took possession of this new jail. As I'd said before, he was sheriff at the time the Civil War broke out, so he was out of his job in February of 1862 when civil law in Stewart County was suspended in favor of martial law. But he was the sheriff pro tem when civil law did resume in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. So he was allowed to take his old job back, in essence. Some of the occupants of this 1857 jail: J.R. Gillum got 60 days in this jail for tippling to slaves. Tippling was selling liquor without a license, and it was especially offensive to sell to slaves. That's why he got such a long jail sentence. 60 days was a long time just for tippling. Elias Garner got 10 days in this jail in 1860 for tippling on a Sunday, and we still have remnants of the blue laws, selling liquor on Sunday type laws, even today. Another occupant of this jail was another slave involved with another murder. Sarah, who was enslaved by William M. Bruton, was jailed for the murder of her mistress, Emmeline Bruton, in 1860. Sarah actually got a mistrial in her first mistrial, but while waiting her next trial, she actually died in jail, so we don't know a lot of the detail of this particular murder. But, perhaps not coincidentally, Emmeline Bruton, who had been murdered by her slave, was a sister of Penina Fletcher, who had been murdered by her slave Barry. So these two sisters were daughters of Nathan Skinner, and it is a bit of a tradition in the Skinner family even today that the Skinners were mean to their slaves. You've got two of the Skinner daughters having been murdered, and one of them basically because she was mean to her slaves. Also in this jail was John Counts. He was indicted for murdering W.B. Gilbert in 1860, and he was still in this jail awaiting trial when the Civil War broke out in 1861. His attorney, Washington Lowe, made a special arrangement, though, for John Counts to be released from jail and the charges dropped if Counts would go into the Confederate Army, and that's what happened. But Counts died while he was in the Army. Consequently, attorney Washington Lowe never got paid for defending John Counts and arranging this deal for him. And the reason we know this is because we have a court case at the county archives where Washington Lowe was suing the administrator of John County's estate in 1865. So what happened to this jail during the Civil War? We have this report from February of 1862 from an Ohio newspaper stating that the bodies of 8 Union men had been found in the jail after the fall of Fort Donelson, and that they seemed to have been either murdered or just allowed to starve to death in the dungeon of this jail. Another story from this jail during the Civil War was printed many years later. 1927 Stewart County Times tells us of the fate of Johnny McLaren. And the story on Johnny McLaren was that he was in a regiment that had been garrisoned in Dover after the fall of Fort Donelson, that his mother had come down from the north to see him and had registered at that Horn Hotel here on Petty Street, just up the hill from the jail, that Johnny had snuck away from his regiment to see his mama, but was found and then put in the jail there on Petty Street. Unfortunately for Johnny, 3 guerrillas, rebel guerrillas that were in the jail with him had escaped, and Johnny made the poor decision to go with them. Johnny was recaptured and then shot by firing squad for his escape. So what happened to this jail during the war? We know that in August of 1862 that the courthouse was burned when Woodward tried to retake Dover. We have a good clue about what happened to this jail from a map that was drawn in 1924 and presented by C.L. Morris, who was a veteran of the 83rd Illinois. The 83rd was garrisoned in Dover during most of the war. In 1924, Mr. Morris presented the map I'm about to show you to John Trotwood Moore, who was the Tennessee State Librarian. This event was covered in the Nashville newspaper that Mr. Morris had come down to tour Fort Donelson and the old battlefield and had gone to Nashville to present this map to John Trotwood Moore. The map is called the Map of Dover and the Battlefield, so it's referring to what Dover looked like at the time of the Battle of February 3rd, 1863, the so-called Second Battle of Fort Donelson, or the Battle of Dover. So here's the map, and I'm going to zoom in on it a little bit so that you can see it a little better. What I want to point out to you is that Cumberland River's at the bottom, and here at the lower landing, or rather the upper ferry landing, you see jail number 5 across the street from the Dover Hotel, which here is labeled hospital. Going up Petty Street, we see what would be the Rice House, and next to it, another 2-story building, which is the hotel that at this time was known as the Horn House or the Horn Hotel, later to be known as the Robertson Hotel, and still later as Mattie Morgan's boarding house. And then turning the corner and coming up Spring Street, we see this 2-story large building, which was the Bannister House. Going further up Spring Street, we see a post office. These tents here show you where in town the different regiments or companies of the 83rd were garrisoned. Here at the public square, where there should have been a courthouse, the courthouse was gone, we know from the August of 62 fire. It was replaced by what was said to be a siege gun, and you can see there are no buildings left on the public square by February of 63. Going further down Main Street, this building here labeled Bakery was the grocery house of Jack Henson, who at the time of the war was operated by his son George Henson. Next to that on Main Street was the dry goods store of Mrs. Shryock, and her house was here on the corner where Taco John's is now, labeled as Colonel Harding's quarters. That brings us over to Church Street. You can see the church here drawn in large scale. You can see guns pointed down Church Street and behind town as defensive mechanisms. Here on the corner of Church Street and Main Street, you see what's labeled as the guardhouse and band room. This was the hotel of Nathan Brandon. It was called at the time the Union Inn. So this is the corner of Church Street and Main Street. It was this guardhouse that George Henson, who became a guerrilla leader, escaped from. during the war. I want to show you show you the buildings that we know survived the war. After this map in 1924 was presented to the state librarian and featured in the Nashville newspaper, a Dover resident named Guy Wilbur Jackson wrote to the newspaper and said that only 4 buildings had survived Dover after this map was referenced. So those 3 of those 4 buildings that we do know survive or of course the Dover Hotel, which survives today, the Surrender House. The what would be the Robertson Hotel, later Maddie Morgan's, we know survived the war. And then the Bannister House on Spring Street survived the war. A potential 4th building that Guy Wilbur Jackson may have been referring to was the Ring House, which was right on the river. The location isn't quite accurate because the Ring House was located on the lot that is today F&M Bank. So it was on the side of Main Street, but close to the river. The reason we think the Ring House may be the 4th building that survived was that the value of this property was the same before and after the war. So most of the town lots went down in value because the buildings had been burned or torn down, but this lot didn't change in value. So perhaps it's the 4th building. But in a moment, I'll suggest another building that may have been the 4th building to survive. This map, if you're not familiar with it, is available on the Tennessee State Archives website called TIVA, Tennessee Virtual Archive. I show you here the link to that website. And if you'll go to the search box and type Dover Battlefield, the first result that comes up is the map I just showed you in case you want to download it. So what happened to the jail number 5 we're on now, during the war is an interesting matter of speculation. In April of 1866, the county court minutes talk about another jail tax, and it's said to be raising a fund for the purpose of repairing the jail of the county. If the jail had been burned or torn down, you wouldn't need to repair it. So the word repairing there was very interesting to me. Perhaps jail number 5 did survive the war in some form enough to where it was possible to repair it rather than having to rebuild new. However, a few months later, in January of 1867, the county courts have paid members of a jail building committee, it's called, who reported that the contract for building a new jail had been let to J.J. Lemaster, who had built the previous jail, for $1,350, and that the jail itself was complete. So this suggests that whatever was left of that old jail maybe had been torn down and a new building built in its place. J.J. Lemaster was a carpenter in Dover. As I said, he had built the previous jail. He would eventually move to Clarksville and become the sexton of the city cemetery, now called Riverview Cemetery. Some of the sheriffs that operated out of jail number 6, W.C. Keel took possession of this new jail and served a couple of terms. He was the first sheriff elected after the Civil War. He was succeeded by P.T. Wofford and George Brandon, who served 1 term each. And then C.C. Rawls served a couple of terms. More about him in a moment. Some of the occupants of jail number 6. After the war, many people were jailed for not being able to afford bail. At this time, it cost $250 to bail out of jail, and that wasn't a cash payment that you had to make. You just had to prove that you were worth $250 in order to bond out of jail. But after the war, money was hard to come by. People had lost their homes and their livelihoods, so it was harder for people to prove that they were worth $250. So we see many people being put into this jail simply because they couldn't afford bail. John Campbell, Cass Campbell, John Mathis, and Eli Stavely escaped to this jail, another Stewart County tradition, for robbing G.W. Gatlin's grocery house. Jenny West spent 5 minutes in this jail in 1870 for stealing some clothing. This was really a quiet period. The post-war period was quiet in terms of crimes and activity at the jail. The county was really focused on rebuilding its courthouse after it got this jail going, rebuilding the courthouse that was completed in 1870. In 1872, there was an escape from this jail. Reuben Mathis, Jack Hood, John Bibb, and William Bogart escaped. The sheriff at the time, George Brandon, was up in town away from the jail. Remember, the jail's down at the foot of Petty Street. He was not held responsible for that escape. As I said, this was a quiet period in terms of crime, and the Clarksville newspaper actually went so far as to report at one time the Stewart County Jail has been empty for months. Now it's possible that they reported that after this escape, that was why the jail was empty, but it seems to have been a relatively quiet period in terms of occupants of the jail. This jail carried on a county tradition. When it was only 8 years old, it burned to the ground on March 11, 1875. The newspaper says this was the third jail destroyed by fire. I've only told you about 2 jail fires, however. So if it's accurate that this was the third jail, that could lend credence to the possibility that the Civil War era jail had actually been burned. The county was in no rush to rebuild jail number 7. They again started sending prisoners to Clarksville. They waited 9 months and then finally appointed a jail building committee who were at liberty to create a jail plan, pick where they wanted to build a jail. They weren't obligated to use the lot there on Petty Street. A few months later, they announced another jail tax. It was also going to be a workhouse tax. So this jail was going to be a county workhouse as well as a jail. The county court wanted the committee to find out how much it would cost to get a temporary iron cage to be put in the courthouse until a jail could be built. Months went by, however, and the county court told the committee to get a cage immediately and finish up the plans for the jail. 1 story high, forget about the workhouse. We do need a jailer's residence at a safe distance. But the word immediately there in January of 1877 turned into 10 months. 10 months later, the committee finally purchased a jail lot on Main Street just off the public square. This is the lot that many people will think of as the jail lot. They bought that for $150 from James Scarborough. March of 1878, county finally commissioned those long-ordered cages from Geiser and Sons of Clarksville and put those cages in the courthouse until the jail could be finished. The jail wasn't finished until April of 1879, which was 4 years after the previous one had been burned down. When the cages were finally delivered to the courthouse, it says here that Dover will have no necessity to send her prisoners away from home for safekeeping. Some of the sheriffs who worked out of jail number 7 here on Main Street, W.C. Biggs, didn't have a jail. They were still fussing about building the jail the whole time that he was sheriff. J.A. Townsend took possession of this jail but had to resign for health reasons. He was succeeded by Sheriff Parker, who himself died of typhoid fever, and then his successor, Charles Wolfe, went out of office because he clandestinely and prematurely abandoned the county. So we had a run of short-term sheriffs there for various reasons. He was succeeded by George Bufford, who himself had to resign. His successor was C.C. Rawls, who had served a previous term as sheriff, and so he was reelected. And then Sheriff Rawls was succeeded by A.C. Turner, who served several terms, but not without controversy. A.C. Turner in 1891 was indicted for malicious mischief and high misdemeanors against Rebecca Milam. And let me tell you what Rebecca Milam accused Sheriff Turner of doing. He unlawfully, scandalously, wickedly, willfully, and outrageously broke open the doors of Rebecca Milam. He scattered her household goods to the four winds. He turned over her ash hopper. He threw her ashes in a pot of soap. He took the split side of her old cotton bonnet, pulled up her gourd vines, broke up 2 hens' nests, and not any 2 hens, old settin' hens. He ran all the dogs off her place, put her old cat in a churn of milk, and bobbed off the cow's tail. Well, Sheriff Turner wasn't indicted, wasn't convicted of this indictment. And in fact, he was reelected after this, and he served another 3 terms in the early 1900s. So he was a popular sheriff. I'm not sure what he did to so offend Mrs. Milam. Sheriff Turner was succeeded in office by S.B. Crane, who served several terms in office. Some of the occupants of jail number 7, Andrew McBride and Will Anglin, were indicted. Andrew was 15 years old. He was the mail carrier from Tobaccoport to Dover. He was charged in 1885 for robbing from the mail sack. The mail sack arrived at the Blue Creek post office on its way to Dover, and the postmaster at Blue Creek noticed that the mail bag had been cut open and then sewn back shut. So they questioned Andrew and Will and found out that they had robbed a few registered letters from this mail bag. The newspaper also reported the story that it was thought that Anglin and McBride had done a similar robbery earlier, but that they were very suddenly transformed from two ragged, motley-faced urchins working for $1.50 a week to a pair of most pretentious dudes with stylish clothes on their backs and fat wallets in their pockets. I didn't know that in the 1880s they even knew the word dudes there, so I chuckled when I saw that. Also in this jail was George Washington. He murdered Egbert Fagan in 1880. He was actually taken out of this jail and lynched by a mob. This was reported quite far and wide in the newspapers, probably because George Washington was a black man and he had a famous name, and that he was lynched. There were escapees from this Dover, another Stewart County tradition. William Good, John Terrell, William Verhaines, and Newport Ross escaped in 1887. This was a cold winter morning. They had asked the jailer for some whiskey, and when he brought it to them, they overpowered him. John Terrell had been in this jail indicted for murder, and after his escape, he fled to Texas. And it was about 15 years later, one of his kinfolk ratted him out, and he was apprehended and taken back to Dover for trial, but he was actually acquitted in that trial. His nephew, Maxie Terrell, who had also escaped from jail, had some years earlier been convicted of the murder, but Maxie himself died in jail awaiting his trial. My friend Melissa Barker at the Houston County Archives and Museum, knowing that I was preparing this talk, gave me this newspaper clipping. In it, we see that a man named A.H. Bottom was in the county jail charged with obtaining goods under false pretenses, but he had brought suit against Sheriff Turner, and that's the same sheriff that was so mean to Rebecca Milam. He brought suit against Sheriff Turner, charging him with putting him in the cell with a crazy man and giving him unwholesome food. Melissa asked me, "Oh, do you know about this crazy man?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I know about this crazy man. He is my favorite tale from the jail. Let me tell you about him." James Varner was born about 1833. He arrived, best we can tell, in Stewart County about 1866. It didn't take long for the county court to realize that he was crazy, that he was a lunatic. They actually sent him to the asylum in Nashville in January of 1867. But one day at that asylum, he was handed a wooden bucket and told to go to the Cumberland River and get a bucket of water. When he got to the river, instead he turned west and started walking along the riverbank until he had made it all the way back to Dover. So he walked all the way back to Dover with that bucket still in his hand, it says. He was dangerous when angry, it says in the record, and then the county actually sent him back to the asylum in 1873, and he escaped again. He was actually in the jail when it burned in 1875, and he survived the fire. This was when the jail was on the Petty Street, and just up the hill was the Robertson Hotel. And Mr. Robertson, the proprietor of the hotel, heard the alarm call for the jail fire and went down there. And Mr. Varner said, "Cord, get me out of here." The hotel owner was Cord Robertson. So Mr. Varner survived the 1875 jail fire. In 1882, the county court ordered James Varner, a lunatic, to be set at liberty during his good behavior, and if he does not behave himself, to be returned to jail. And it wasn't long before he was returned to jail. He just was happier in jail, and he was dangerous when angry. They were just better off with Mr. Varner being in jail, and he seemed to have liked it just fine. James Varner once went 16 years without talking to anybody. And when he did start talking, he claimed that he was a Civil War veteran, a veteran of the 1st Pennsylvania Reserve Cavalry. The judge investigated his story and found out it was true. James Varner started getting a pension while in jail until he died in Dover in 1915. His death certificate says this party was insane and had been in jail here for 40 years. So in 1915, he's 82. He dies in Dover, and he's a Union veteran. So where is he buried? He's buried at Fort Donelson, grave number 676, James Varner of Pennsylvania. This jail, as many jails in Stewart County, eventually had issues. In February of 1891, the Clarksville paper says no one can be kept in the jail that cares to get out of it, and that now would be a good time to sell the whole affair and put the prisoners in a hole in the river bluff. Long-standing tradition, the county took no action on this latest protest of the sufficiency of jail number 7. And then this jail continued, surprise, surprise, a long-standing county tradition. In 1897, it burned to the ground, actually killing 3 of the occupants, William Black, Mr. Nebley, and an unnamed black woman. But James Varner, the crazy guy, survived this jail fire as well. The sheriff at the time, S.B. Crane, was actually in Clarksville under a physician's care, and the jailer, who would have normally been staying here at the jail, was oversleeping in the sheriff's house, so there was no one in the jail to have heard the alarm call. Although the newspaper does tell us that the origin of the fire was a mystery, but that an old crazy man was seen about the building sometime before the fire, so it's possible that our friend Mr. James Varner may have actually set this fire of jail number 7. Defying county tradition, the county did act quickly this time, though. In April of 1897, right after the fire, the county had already lined up authorization from the state to issue $8,000 in bonds to fund the building of a new jail. The county ends up issuing $7,000 of those bonds. This jail was 2 stories. It was to be fireproof. At the time, less than half the county jails in Tennessee were fireproof. This jail was going to have a lower floor with at least 3 jail cells, and then an upper floor with 4 secure rooms for, quote, lunatics who are hopelessly insane and women who may be put in for small offenses. So they're designing this jail with James Varner in mind. Jailer's residence was connected to the jail, and the contract went to the Pauley Jail Company of St. Louis, who bid $5,900. Construction went quickly on this jail. By November of 1897, the paper reports that the new jail will soon be completed, that it is of such superb workmanship that it'll take a man of pretty fair character to get admission into it, and the mercy of a court and an ordinary jury to get out of it. We have pictures of this jail. This is the earliest jail for which we have photos. You see on the left, looking towards the bridge, it's this dark building with the double chimneys, is the 1897 jail, a real good picture of it here, and the lovely models here in front of the jail and the pickup truck are Sandra Bruton and Joanne Cockrell. To many people, this is what they remember as the old jail. Some of the sheriffs who served out of this long-serving jail, S.B. Crane, Mr. Scarborough, Sam Phippen was popular, served multiple terms. Lucas Ellis served several terms as sheriff, and he's the only sheriff that we have lost in the line of duty. He was shot by Wiley Howell in 1935 and died a few months later in July of 1936. Clyde Trinkle is fondly remembered during the war and post-war years as sheriff, and Seaman Spiceland served 16 years as sheriff at various times, the second longest serving sheriff in the county's history. Some of the occupants of this long-serving jail. Nip Bell was briefly in this jail. He had been arrested for the 1926 murder of Rufus Joyner at Parkertown. Nip was actually taken by a mob of 75 people from this jail and taken back to Parkertown and lynched. There are pictures that are floating around of Nip hanging in the tree. We have one at the archives, but I don't show it here. There's also the very sensational murder of Grady and Rafine Cherry. in 1943 by Hicks and Luffman, who were ultimately executed by the state for these murders. We have at the county archives evidence from that murder. We have 4 bullets found unspent from the murder weapon and the 2 shell casings found at the murder scene. Other occupants of this long-serving jail: Sam Wallace got 90 days in this jail in 1929 for possessing a still. Tom Ward in 1938 got a DUI, $10 fine, 30 days in jail, lost his license. 1933 happily reported that the prisoners at this jail were working 8 hours a day, so it was a functioning workhouse. There were escapes from this jail, as there were from all its predecessors. In April of 31, Sug Powers, Preston Robertson, and Herbert Wofford had escaped this jail. Herbert Wofford was actually in this jail because he was a trustee and had made a key to assist other prisoners from escaping, so he himself was in this jail for assisting a jail escape, and then he himself broke out of jail. Also in this jail in 1947 were Kelsey Mitchison and W.F. Higgins of Eddyville. They had robbed Joe Earhart at his grocery of $400 and Mr. Earhart's billfold. The reason that this one caught my attention is because at the county archives we have the wallets of these 2 prisoners, and I don't know why they would have kept these wallets. These were not Mr. Earhart's wallet that was stolen, but the wallets of the 2 victims, and they are complete. We have their social security cards, Navy ID card, hunting licenses, and whatnot. I don't show you here, but one of these wallets does contain pornographic pictures that we keep in the wallets in our safe at the archives. Both of these men pled guilty and were sentenced to 5 to 15 years in the state penitentiary. Mr. Mitchison died in prison of stomach cancer. Mr. Higgins served his time and lived until the 1960s. Another sensational case of men that were in this jail briefly. In December of 1956, there were 6 men who escaped from a jail in Georgetown, Texas, stole guns and cars, and just coincidentally came through Dover, Tennessee as part of their escape. They actually stopped at the Spring Grill Motel and robbed Hiram and Maud Reed Wallace, tied up his uncle, Mr. Wilkinson, stole guns from it. These men made several mistakes of not only, of course, the robbery, but when they were coming through downtown Dover, they missed the turn to get across the bridge and kept going down Church Street, caught the attention of a highway patrolman, and there was actually a gunfire exchange, and they wounded the highway patrolman, took possession of his car with him in it still wounded but playing dead so as not to be shot further, and then wrecked that car. When they wrecked the patrolman's car, the 6 men decided to split up into pairs to make it easier to escape. So when they were arrested, 2 of the men were found on the riverbank in their undershorts. This was December. They had thought they could swim the river, but it was just too cold. So when they were apprehended in their undershorts on the riverbank, they were trying to tie together logs and tires and driftwood to make a raft to get across the river and escape to freedom. The reason this caught my eye is because the names of those 2 men who were on the riverbank in their underwear were Robert Riviera and James Long. So I feel like I need to apologize to the Wallace family who were victimized by these men for someone of an otherwise good name committing this crime. This jail number 8, defied the odds, and it neither burned down nor fell down in the 63 years that it served the county. It's been our longest jail so far, but by 1960 it was time for a new jail. In October of 1859, the county court had approved plans for a new jail on the existing site near the public square on the jail lot. Contract was awarded to Brigham Hardware and Fox Brothers, and construction progressed quickly. The open house was held on July 16 and 17 of 1960. This is the jail that some of the younger folks will think of as the old jail. Many men served in this jail as sheriff. I show you their pictures here. Charlie Crockrell took possession of this jail. David Hicks was our longest serving sheriff. He served 18 years. And at this point, I want to mention the pictures that we have of the sheriffs. This photo collection was actually put together by Sheriff Hicks. And these photos hung for many years in this jail, in jail number 9. The photos have since been donated by Sheriff Gray to the Stewart County Archives, and we intend to make a permanent display of this law enforcement photo collection. It's a collection not just of the sheriffs of Stewart County, but many of the law enforcement professionals who've served the county. This uh, jail served up until 2016. It had gotten into some bad condition and they couldn't hold any women in it. They could only hold 18 inmates. A lot of the prisoners had to be sent to Henry County. So in 2016, Sheriff Derek Wyatt took possession of Stewart County's 10th jail, which was built by Lashley Rich and Parchman Construction Companies. It opened at a cost of $7.5 million, 128 beds, including the sheriff's office. It's an administrative space. It was built with room to grow if need be, and it is ably managed by our current sheriff, Frankie Gray. May it long be before the tales of this jail need to be told. I hope you've enjoyed the history of Stewart County's many jails. Did you get number 10 as the correct number of jails that we've had? I hope it's a long time before the next jail needs to come along. And I appreciate you listening.